Today's pre-conference webinar is titled Using Technology to Support Food Chain Sustainability. This panel will explore livestock technological advances, genetic testing, herd management software, and other precision livestock farming technologies that can empower farmers and ranchers today to make more educated management decisions. Before I turn things over to today's moderator, I'd like to get your opinion on a poll question. So which livestock technological advancement do you believe has the most potential to be a game changer? Genetic testing, herd management software, including feed, health, and productivity, livestock activity monitoring, new treatments or medicines for animal health challenges, or something else? And whatever that something else is, please do share it with us in the chat. So it looks like a tie between most of them. So it looks like all genetic testing, herd management software, livestock activity monitoring, and new treatments and medicines are all really great tools that we can use to be a game changer with livestock technological advancement. I am going to turn things over to Christi Calhoun. She is from Zoetis, and she is their Senior Manager of Food and Technology.
Thanks, Casey, and welcome everyone. Today we're discussing technology as it links or assists or enhances sustainable food, and specifically looking through the lens of animal proteins. The word technology can encompass many things, just as we hear about the word sustainability, meaning different things, and it depends on your point of reference. With more attention on sustainable practices throughout agriculture, including livestock production, technology is increasingly becoming synonymous with sustainability. More recognition is being given to the great work livestock farmers have accomplished over the decades, but much of it with the aid of innovation means we need to continue to keep working and telling our story and enhancing that work that's being done. Amongst the topics of technology and sustainability is the consumer. And research has shown that when consumers hear the word sustainability connected to animal proteins, they first think about animal welfare, but is quickly followed by the environment. And in fact, one study showed that 42% of consumers desire transparency to make better informed purchase decisions because they believe their food decision can impact the environment. So during today's webinar, our panelists are going to explore and share insights on several of these points: technology, sustainability, consumer, transparency, and so that you can leave better informed on the challenges and opportunities, is maybe the better word, in animal proteins, but also how innovation and technology can be part of the solution. So with us today to share perspectives are Joan Ruskamp. She and her husband, Steve, run J&S Feedlot and Farm in Nebraska, which has been in the family for more than 100 years. Joan is an active voice within the beef industry, advocating for proactive cattle health management and sustainable practices. On her own farm, the commitment to cattle health and sustainable growth honors the work of the previous generations and preserves the farmland for the next generation and the community around them. Then we have Dr. Scott Eiler, who is the Consumer Technical Lead for Cargill Protein North America. In this role, he leads technical communications and technical issue management with key retail, food service, and protein ingredient customers. Immediately prior to this role, he was Director of Customer Quality for Cargill Protein, where he oversaw the execution and improvement of product quality, as well as technical services for Cargill's customers. Then rounding out our speaker panel is Dr. Justin Sexten, who is the head of industry and network partnerships for precision animal health at Zoetis. In this role, Justin uses industry experience to guide partnerships at the intersection of technology, software, and genetics. Prior to joining Zoetis, he served as Director of Supply Development for Certified Angus Beef, where he led production education and research efforts. So today we're going to start off by hearing from Joan, and we are going to start partway through. We will take some Q&A and then kind of have a second half of the session. So Joan, I'll let you take it.
Well, good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are who are watching. As Christi mentioned, my husband Steve and I farm in Northeast Nebraska. The farm has been in the Ruskamp family for over 100 years. Steve and I bought the farm from his uncle in 1981, and it's a huge difference in what the farm looks like, because when his grandparents farmed, they ran cattle and pigs together in pens. Not a lot was known about nutritional differences, but they were basically trying to survive in agriculture. And we have moved through the century of time, really fine-tuning the nutritional need differences between cattle and pork and poultry and what they need to thrive. And so our whole focus in the feed yard world is helping cattle to thrive. And it's pretty easy because they have 4 basic needs. They need water, of course, quality food helps, place to lay down, and socialize. And if we can provide those 4 basic needs, then we can fine tune everything else to help them thrive more. The cycle of cattle involved in grass, grain, manure, and crops, and that whole cycle of producing beef from that is an incredibly beautiful story. So we take our role pretty seriously in honoring not only what our the grandparents before us did, but how we can improve upon that by using less resources and managing the resources we have of manure from the cattle. And then we have a holding pond that holds all the water from our feed yard with the nutrients that come off of the runoff from the feed yard. We use that to irrigate our corn. And so all of that together, along with, we'll talk about technology later, but the technologies that help us provide those 4 basic needs that cattle have, again, in thriving. We raised 5 children on our farm and now have 9 grandchildren. And they all know quite well the story just from being with us and how important it is that every animal is watched and monitored and cared for, and with that overall goal of the food that they're going to eat for supper that night or back home or in another state, that we provide this. We're focused on the product we're providing, and that's beef. But we're also focused on the welfare of that animal, the quality of the air and the land around us, because it overall impacts everyone. And so whenever we can do more using less and still supersede the way we have an impact on the environment, we feel like we're being more sustainable with every tool we have to help us do that.
Okay, thanks, Joan, for giving us a glimpse and a start and a look at your operation. You've spurred a lot of questions I'm going to have already. It's great hearing directly from somebody that's walking agriculture in the dirt day to day. So we will come back to you right now. We will hear from Dr. Eiler with his background in meat production, but also serving retail and food service. He's listening to the consumer kind of through 2 types of lenses. And so we're going to hear from him from sustainability and technology's role in their work. Scott.
Thanks, Christi. And I appreciate the chance to be here and appreciate the chance to be a part of the Animal Ag Alliance efforts. Cargill appreciates the chance to be a part of Animal Ag Alliance efforts. Our perspective, as Christi said, is that of a brand owner as well as a server of brands, right? We focus not just on the brands that Cargill owns, we also focus on, the retail, the packaged goods companies, and the food service brands. We try to protect those brands as if they're our own, right? At Cargill, we talk about a purpose being to nourish the world in a safe, responsible, and sustainable way. Those words can just be words on a PowerPoint slide. What we truly live and what we truly think about every day is the impact that we're leaving on the world around us. That's the responsible and sustainable portion of that, right? And these are complex areas, as you all know. There are areas that we're managing not just within the 4 walls of North America or within the 4 walls of the United States, but as we think about a global food supply chain. As we think about consumer perceptions about sustainability, the purest definition of sustainability, the type of things that Joan talked about, are not necessarily what come front of mind when consumers think about sustainability. In fact, you know, the minimal processing of an animal, animals that are raised with less technology inputs from a pharmaceutical standpoint, less intensively, maybe longer age on life, longer age on the planet, those tend to have the images of being a more sustainable supply chain. And so this is the paradigm that we're dealing with, and it's a very difficult paradigm to shift, in that what is often perceived as sustainability is truly not sustainability in the sense of preserving the resources that we have, the finite resources that we have on the globe. In my career, I can think back, as I was preparing for this session, I was thinking back to some of the most controversial technologies, since this is a technology discussion, that consumed a great deal of time, and that, quite frankly, were technologies that got started and had to take a pause because consumer backlash against the technology was so fierce, right? These were technologies about how we harvest greater sources of lean beef from beef animals. They might be, in one case, this was about packaging technology that dramatically could reduce food waste. But yet, they were technologies, and they were cast as evil, right? And so I think that's a backdrop that we have to remember, right? Is that the basic forms of technology that we think about from an animal production standpoint, you know, judicious use of antibiotics to prevent illness that will result in higher productivity, right? The potential to use growth implants that will allow for their better conversion of feed inputs to food sources, right? Even concentrated animal feeding, to many, are the antithesis, right? They're the direct opposite of what we think of, what a consumer thinks about is sustainable practices. So this is one of the challenges, right? That we've just got to remember, is that what we in the animal production world can define as sustainability can sometimes seem is the exact opposite to a group of consumers. When I think about this conversation, I think that any of these when we think about supply chains, any of the supply chains, they really have to stand on their own 2 or 4 sustainability feet, right? Or fins, depending on what we're talking about, right? We're obligated to make the least impact on the environment. And it doesn't matter whether it's conventionally raised animals, whether it's more minimally processed, lower intensity animals, such as an antibiotic-free or an organic system. It doesn't matter whether it's aquaculture, whether it's plant-based protein alternatives, or in the future, cellular-based cultivated protein. Each of them have to stand on their own 2 feet from the standpoint of sustainability and from the standpoint of using the least amount of resources possible. An example I thought of this morning was, we offer a lot of egg products today, and a great degree of the egg industry has moved to cage-free. And there's a certain amount of concern that while cage-free production, contrasted to normal production, normal egg production, layer production, can be perceived and can be realized as a better animal welfare solution for the birds, doesn't necessarily mean to lower resource intensity. At the same time, there's a demand for cage-free eggs. We're going to offer cage-free eggs, right? This is what some consumers are asking for. Our jobs are to make sure that those cage-free eggs have the least environmental impact possible. We're going to enable choice. And that's one of the key messages that I bring across, is that there's going to be less intensively raised animals, and there's going to be animals that are raised in a fashion that truly maximize the amount of food raised per inputs that we get. And each of them have to have a basis on maximizing the resource preservation of each of those systems. I have the distinction as an animal scientist and a meat scientist as having 3 vegan sisters. 3 of them, not 1, not 2, but 3. vegan sisters, staunch. I'm not talking flexitarians, I'm talking vegan sisters. And I love them all three, and they love me. I think they do. They don't necessarily love my line of work. They still love me. I'm not going to convince my three vegan sisters, as hard as I try, I'm not going to convince them to start consuming animal protein, right? They're going to consume plant-based proteins. They love the work that Cargill's doing around plant-based proteins. They love it. They think it's admirable. But even that, right? If we fail to produce those plant-based proteins in the most responsible manner possible, they're going to move away, right? The more that they learn, they'll make choices, and they'll make choices to those things that truly make them feel better. Let's talk a little bit about the concept of the brand owners, right? We serve many customers, right? We serve food service customers that may cater to a target audience that crave innovation, crave menu innovation, crave a brand imagery, crave accessible food, right, at very affordable prices. Most consumers aren't necessarily front of mind thinking about sustainability every time they go to a drive-thru and make a purchase. However, they are thinking about this. They're thinking about this idea that don't make me embarrassed by my food choices, right? And are the brands that we serve, at a minimum, they owe this to their customers. So look, while I may be making some food choices that not necessarily everybody's going to make, at the end of the day, don't make me apologize for the food that I'm consuming. Similarly, our customers have shareholders, right? And they're going to act. These shareholders care deeply about the companies that they own and the companies that they invest in and the impact that those companies are having on the environment. And we owe it to those customers to make sure that they have the right, not just a story to tell, but they have substance behind their responsible sourcing. Price, value, consistency. Those are never going to go out of vogue as it pertains to what consumer choices that we make. We're all feeding families. Joan talked about that. We're all feeding families. And one of our obligations is to make sure that for those of us that are feeding our families, we got to make sure that we're focused on providing them something that they can truly feel good about, that they can feel proud of. Thanks, Christi.
Thanks, Scott. Well, I love panels. This is setting up perfectly because we just heard Joan say, her 100-year history of her farm, they've went from just trying to survive to, adopting and changing, so now trying to thrive. Some of that, I'm sure, we'll hear more about included technology. Scott just tells us that, I love the title of this slide, start with the end user in mind. I mean, the consumer, that's why they're part of this discussion. We have we think great ideas and solutions, but what will they accept and understand? And so that sets up perfectly for Dr. Justin Sexten to tell us about what he thinks and focuses on every day in his job is trying to solve these problems and bring solutions. So Justin, let's hear your perspective on technology and sustainability.
Thank you, Christi, and thank you, Animal Ag Alliance, for giving us the opportunity to have the chat today using technology that arguably 3 years ago, none of us would have thought about attending webinars, frankly, in this setting, right? So we have the opportunity to sit in our offices at home or the office at work and hear perspectives from across the supply chain. So just another example of how technology is providing additional insights to the consumers as well as those of us involved in the production aspect of the business. The perspective that I bring today is really how we think about the technological solutions that provide information and ultimately validation around the practices that producers are using every day to deliver a product to the consumer. We think about that as a technology company, Precision Animal Health, of helping the producer manage the large number of data sources that ultimately can confirm for those brands that Scott mentioned, animal welfare, animal well-being, and ultimately, as brands evolve, sustainability as well. And today, whether we have a beef animal in the center of this picture, we have a chicken in the middle of the picture, a pig, whatever that is, there are multiple sources of data and information that every aspect of the business is interested in, and how we collect and integrate that in a way to make decisions is really where we see the future of animal health and well-being coming together. And one of the things from a technology perspective, it's ultimately converting all of these data points, whether it's genetic information, whether it's sensor information, whether it's just the information we're gathering as we care for the animal every day at the chute or by the pen, as well as environmental information and feed. All of that comes together as data, but ultimately something has to work to integrate that into decisions at the production level that Joan is dealing with, but also provide insights to the end user in a label, in a product that ultimately they can understand and have faith in. And that's where we see the opportunity for technology to integrate data into informations and inform buying decisions around an increasingly interesting topic of sustainability. Christi, if you go to the next slide, we'll transition as to how that ultimately is expressed. I think as we frame up technology, we see technology come in a lot of different ways. I think many people would see technology associated with sensors and computing types of technologies. Scott mentioned many of the technologies that exist in harvest and management. I think one of the most fundamental technologies available today is genetic improvement. As we think about the opportunity for brands to make claims around sustainability, genetic improvement is one that very few consumers can object against. It's not an injectable, it's not a hormone, it's not any of those key points that consumers have opposition against, but it's a technology that has been used for generations to make improvements in the supply chain around sustainability. And as we think about technology, genetic testing, as many of you indicated on the poll, is one of those tools. But also we think about how do we design systems using technologies to make better decisions. And the example that I have here in the picture is how do we manage an individual animal in a pen type of an environment? I think whether you're managing a finishing barn or a broiler system, right? Each of those, ultimately, we think about those as units, but getting the most out of an animal's genetic potential is really, I would argue, one of the great definitions of sustainability. When we achieve 100% of the animal's genetic potential, then that is a sustainable system if we've done it in a way that allows the animal to express that in a normal manner, utilizing the resources available to it. And so we think about technology to maybe make those systems smaller and not operate in a way that it's best because that's how many animals come on a truck, but it's the way to take what we know about that genetic potential and communicate it in a way that the animal can express the genetic potential with minimal inputs. Technology is going to continue to evolve. We've seen it in the row crop industry, where at one time, producers would manage a field, and now they started into managing regions of fields, and now we have sub-foot measurements in terms of precision livestock or precision agriculture. Those types of systems are going to make their way into the livestock industry, and ultimately communicating that level of precision and technology will be part of the challenge we have going forward to the consumer.
Right, thanks, Justin. So now we're going to pause and take some Q&A. So if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A box. And while we wait for some of those to come in, as I said, I've got questions. I'll start with Joan. So I appreciate that you gave us a great glimpse on your slide of the diversity of your farm, a lot of things going on there. And even in those images, there were just hints of what I'll call simplistic technology. Can you give us one example? I don't care which one you pick. I mean, maybe it's capturing runoff water, or is it the shade the cattle had? Those are innovative. They're technologies. Tell us about the thought process of why you adopted something and the impact level some of that had.
Sure. It's really all about continually trying to figure out new ways and better ways to do anything. And so whether it's to keep cattle comfortable in Nebraska, the summers get really hot and the winters, they get really cold. And so between having a windbreak, whether it's trees or metal, we can minimize sub-zero temperatures when we've got 40-mile-an-hour winds in the wintertime. We can use corn stalks off of fields where they've got plenty of organic material. We can use that for bedding or for feed. They have two purposes. And when they're used for bedding, that in turn goes back into organic material for crops. The shades also take the extreme of heat that can be detrimental for cattle being comfortable. When you've got large animals and a hot day with no wind, you can't predict those, and they do happen. And so just knowing you're always watching for ways, how can I help these cattle have more comfort while they're here? The land and water, that's a continual thing too, but I think it all goes back to the eyes looking for ways to improve. And that's kind of the way farmers and ranchers and a lot of business people think. How can I do what I'm doing better to have a positive impact on whatever I'm doing, whether it's the animals, on the land, the air quality, the water quality, and so that people downstream from us have fresh water running through that river or that stream that goes through their farm, eventually getting to the Missouri and then to the Mississippi and then to the Gulf of Mexico. Those are significant changes that sometimes you don't know the impact could be negative until you start seeing something. And it's like, well, you have to pull back. And I think Scott or Justin mentioned this. Sometimes we have technologies and it's a consumer reaction that says, well, I don't know if I'm comfortable with that. Well, we do the same ourselves. We see a technology, we start utilizing it, and then we take a second look and say, well, how is this working out here in the real world? The studies may show safety all across the board, but are we comfortable implementing it, or is it even cost effective for us to implement it for the value it gives back? Maybe it gives no difference in value back to us and the cost is prohibitive. That's another thing. We have to think about that because we're hoping to thrive too, along with our animals and the crops that we produce. And so we have to be economically viable. That's a given, because we can't purchase and take advantage of new innovation and technology unless we economically can add that value back into our farm and ranch.
Oh, thank you. That a lot of great points there. Thank you. Scott, there's a question that came in I think would be directed towards you. How do you know how grocery chains are helping with the technology adoption and food chain sustainability? Examples of what's going on there?
The first thing that comes to mind, and it's not, it may be not considered that fantastic of a technology, but it's quite frankly, it's just the basics on supply chain management. And having the right food at the right place at the right time, really understanding the mix and forecasting a demand based upon what they have seen in the past, based upon what they see going forward, and providing that to the supply chain so that the right products can be there, especially in these cases of of short shelf life and perishable commodities. Maybe it's a little less impactful as we think about frozen food and we think about shelf stable, right? When we think about the center of the meat case, right, the fresh meat case, right, the orchestration that has to take place to make sure that they're sending the right signals so that we have the right products made at the right time. That basic supply chain and scheduling and planning technology, it may not seem that exciting, but quite frankly, if we think about sustainability, that's one of the fundamentals of sustainability. Because if they overorder, there's waste, right? If they don't order enough or they don't order in a timely fashion, we're adjusting production schedules, we're jumping through production schedules that are leading to inefficiencies. That's waste, right? So I think one of my first answer on that is the basics of really getting to be great demand planners, getting to be great demand forecasters, and really understanding what's going to move, not just in an overall chain, not just in a region, but at the store level. That's an orchestration and that's a level of technology we don't talk about much, but it's true sustainability.
That's a perfect example that may have not been an example 2 years ago. But again, I think it shed light on the appreciation for consistent supply.
Right.
Okay, thank you. And Joan, one came in for you again. There is interest in learning more specifically about the feedlot runoff collection and then how you irrigate with that. What's that look like?
Sure. I wish I had the visual of the aerial shot of our feed yard. From the west, the water runs in, and from the north into our farm and feed yard. We stopped some water before the feed yard, and my husband converted it into a fish pond. And so we use it for recreational purposes because we can do that. That holds some water. The rest of the water that either falls vertically onto our farm or runs through culverts under the highway into our farm stops on the east side of our farm into a 6-acre holding pond. 6 acres, for folks who, this is a good analogy, is like 6 football fields. An acre is roughly a football field. So that gives you an idea of size. And it's held there with a clay liner. There's monitoring wells all around our feed yard, above and below that holding pond. And those monitoring wells are checked twice a year for levels of like nitrates and other types of nutrients that you want to make sure is not getting into groundwater. And so that's monitored and submitted into the DEQ also. And so it's not just for our information, it's for state and national EPA regulations. That water is held there, and then we have a pump that's in one corner of that pond that runs through pipe. It's all underground now because somebody drove over some one year. And so it's another live and learn thing that you might know where the pipe is, but that doesn't mean everybody else does. And so at some point, we've been able to bury all of our pipe that runs to our center pivot. And then we have a horizontal or a rectangle shaped field that we use what's called a traveling. It's like a big hose reel with a large gun on the end. And we pull it out in that rectangle shape, and then it runs back and pulls back up on that reel. And so we have underground pipe for that field to that system too. And, when we apply that, we have to, one, we test the water to see what it has for nutrients. 2, we have to keep records the day before, the day of, and the day after when we apply that water, what the wind speed is, what direction, what the temperature is, the start and stop times, the pond level. And so there's a lot of detail that goes into how we use that water and what condition the field is. Is it wet? And so then is there runoff, or is it really dry? Is it in between somewhere? Those records also get submitted to the DEQ, the state DEQ. And I'd have to say there is a lot of regulation over the use of the holding pond and the levels and making sure there's no discharge, if there is, and how it's reported, and then how we apply it to the land.
Very complex. Thank you for walking through that. I think I learned a few things at this moment. Okay. In the sake of time, I think we're going to move on to our kind of second part of the delivery. And Justin, I've got a question for you I'm burning to get to, but we're going to hear from each of our panelists another time. So we kind of set up what's the lay of the land, where are the opportunities around sustainability and technology, and now we're going to dig a little bit deeper on what does solutions and adoption look like. So giving it back to Joan.
Thank you. This is where we kind of get more into the technology side. Rural broadband is significant to us being able to adopt more data collection. And for those of you who live by this, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And so for us, measuring whatever the data is, whether it's how much feed, in the top left corner, my husband and I using a software that there's an iPad in the feed truck, there's an iPad in the payloader, and we've used scales for a long time to weigh our feed, but you don't know really how much is being loaded because it kind of depends on the person loading the feed. If they're going to be like, I'm 100 pounds over, that's all right. I'm 100 pounds under. It really depends on the person, right? So you have room for human error. Using this software, you load what you load, and it's tracked. Our nutritionist in the center of Nebraska can be in his home office and watching through the app on his iPad or even your phone what we're doing. And so having the access to the cloud and the internet capabilities help us measure exactly what cattle are being fed and the exact nutrients that are going into that ration, the ingredients. That's important because we want to know the cost of the gain that they're going to be. And so right now, we've got $8 corn. Well, if you're feeding a little bit more corn than what it's calling for, and you're not able to really measure that, you could be undercharging or underestimating what the cattle are costing to feed. And so on the economic side, it's really important. On the health side, it's really important too, because we are finely tuning the feed that they get to match where they are in their phase of finishing. And so you don't want cattle that need more of the roughage side getting too much corn. And as we change their diet as they're there, it's just very time sensitive. And if we can keep their stomach happy, we can pretty much keep them happy. And so that's huge. There's always going to be, I feel like, we can't replace humans in animal care. And so Steve and I, we have protocols through our veterinarians on the best vaccines at what times, and then treatments, what antibiotics work best, and what's the problem. They might just have a stomach ache, basically. And so why would I want to give them an antibiotic for that? We have other things we can do to help them straighten out their stomach. And so the discussion of it, you can have written protocols, but until you have the human eye of assessing, there's certain things you can have. The thermometer and a scale are just really good tools, and they've been around a long time. And I think they'll remain to be good tools when you're not always sure if the animal is really sick. The precision ag, when we're applying any kind of organic fertilizer or synthetic, helps us so that we can make sure that the corn that we raise or the soybeans have the nutrients all across the field. Soil is different, even on our own farm, it's different in different areas. And so having the technology to help us figure out where different needs of the soil are, we can apply nutrients to that soil to help it build it up. I mean, we're always trying to build up soil. And we do chop earlage and corn silage on our farm. And we base that decision on the nutrient profile of the soil. Does the soil need more organic material? If it does, we're going to leave more of that corn stalk and that plant on the ground. When it's starting to get built up, then we'll take more of the plant off and use it as corn silage. We can't always measure that when we're hauling a lot of trucks off the field. And so using that app again allows us to track inventory. And so Steve's amazingly close to his guesstimate on how many tons we'll have. But the app, when we're done feeding through, say, a corn silage pile, the app will tell us exactly how much was fed. And that goes back to the crop side then, and how many bushels or how much tonnage did we get off, but then how did that return happen on the crop side, so that you're always aware of costs and receipts in being able to analyze whether you're profitable or not. Earlier you saw shades. We used to use water lines, and in that bottom right picture, as we feed that feed out, you can see our system, how we would put a tube all along the bunk line with little mister nozzles. And that's how we used to cool cattle. And it's difficult because we're using water, one, it makes mud, two, and you have to just drive around continually monitoring, making sure that the nozzle doesn't get plugged or things like that. When it was the only thing we had, though, until a few years ago, when shades became looked at more often as a tool, and we had a local person building shades. He brought us one, and Steve said, I see a problem right away. You had to have a payloader bucket to scoop up this big tire in, and then load that and then chain it on and then move it. And he says, why don't you build brackets at the bottom there above that tire where the post is that goes up to the shade? So I could take forks in, pick it up and move it around. I don't have to get out, chain it, unchain it, and do all that. Wow. I mean, see, this is where from all through the supply chain, if you share back and forth with each other the needs that you have, you can improve someone before or after you in what you're doing. And so they took that and went back to the shop and then brought us one with the brackets on. And it's a game changer because it's a time savings, right? And we're always trying to be more efficient with our time as well. And there is a labor shortage. And so we have to really be efficient with our time. And so he's been able to move shades around. You have the gate watcher to open and shut gates to move them, but normally the shades stay on the cement for most pens. It just depends on the shape and the direction of the bunk line in that pen. But that's a huge savings. I think one other technology that we really believe in is the use of the hormone implant. We can say pretty confidently that we're saving 15% of the resources needed to produce beef by using an implant. And we can also produce more beef because the animal will get bigger versus no implant, he will get fatter at a smaller weight. And so let's say no implant, he may get fatter at 1,200 pounds. Implant, he'll get fatter or finished at 1,500 pounds. And we already know we're producing 33% more beef with the animals we have than we did in the 70s. We have a lot less animals. So basically, with a lot less animals, we're feeding the same amount of beef as we did in the 70s. That's probably a better way to say that. That's a huge sustainability piece, but we wouldn't be doing it without better genetics, the nutrition management, health management, and that implant that helps that animal. It's just hormones in the animal telling him how to use the feed. There's nothing unsafe or we wouldn't use it. That's key always, safety for the animal, safety for the environment, and safety for the people who are going to eat that beef. That's always first. But now that we know it is, I just don't understand why it isn't a more accepted tool when we see that we have less resources all the time to produce food for folks. And so those are, the technologies are wonderful. Rural broadband will help us continue to grow in that. There's ear tags now that will light up if an animal is sick with labor issues or skilled labor problems. That could be, when it's cost effective, another solution to implement for the welfare, the animal welfare piece. We don't, I don't know how many of you watched Rawhide when you were growing up, but they used to like whoop and holler all the time to move cattle. Well, people like Temple Grandin have really changed that. And so how we work with cattle, the quietness, the body positioning, shape of our facilities, that's technology too in a different way, but it does allow us to, again, help our cattle thrive, help them, they don't happy necessarily, but they're comfortable and they have their needs met. And ultimately, again, we always go back to that. We're producing beef and we know that everything we do has an impact and we want it to be a positive impact.
That was fantastic, Joan. You've hit many elements of sustainability that I think people have top of mind, but a lot of them that we don't usually put in that bucket. And I'm glad you brought up, labor, for instance. So we're going to kind of shift. You perfectly set up comments that I think Justin will make at the end when you said precision animal health, which is actually in his title. So many things to reflect on, but we're going to go over to Scott next. And I think Scott already teed this up a little bit about the disruption in the supply chain and what that means in terms of sustainability. So Scott.
Thanks. Yeah, and I wanted to focus just a little bit, and we can mention we're since March of 2020, right? A supply chain that was stressed but not strained. When I say stressed, I mean it wasn't as if there was lots of excess capacity and there was tremendous amount of excess resources that we could have taken the shock that we did in March of 2020 and just absorbed it, right? It was a stressed supply chain, but it was one that was providing. And now we're clearly in a different reality. And we've moved from the point of our discussions where we said, hey, if we can just get past COVID, right, then things will be different. Well, no, we're in a whole different environment right now. And there's economic shifts, fundamental economic shifts that are taking place in the environment. There are supply chain disruptions that aren't going to be resolved for another couple of years, right? Or at least 12 to 18 months. And there is, as Joan mentioned, we're in a place of a labor deficit at this point. And so the decisions we make around sustainability, the basic decisions we make around sustainability have never been more important, right? The aspect of making sure that we're investing resources, the limited resources that we have, to converting those animals and those animal products into a food that that will resonate with consumers. That's never been, I spent time in R&D, right? We talked about the fact that, hey, some new product development is going to fail. Well, guess what? We have a limited amount of resources, right? We're going to continue to innovate and we're going to continue to grow, but our ability to make sure that we're doing a great job with our customers to introduce products that have a better chance of success, that's just going to preserve the limited resources that we have on filling those supply chains on a daily basis. This idea about inventory management, I already talked about it, never been more critical. It's always been critical. It's fundamental to basic supply chain 101. It's never been more critical than what it is right now. As we think about technologies, and Justin and Joan have already hit on a lot of these, and so I'm not going to go into great depth on it. We have great hopes for this idea that Justin talked about around genetic selection and targeting the maximization of the genetic potential of an animal, not a large group of animals, but even thinking down to the individuals. Some of those things may be hard to scale, but there is tremendous potential there. And we're very bullish on that particular area. This idea of using technology, as Justin talked about, to make better decisions, right? That decisions that allow for avoidance of the application of resources when it's not necessary. Justin's example about precision agriculture is not lost on the animal production, right? Understanding the health conditions by animal so that we can understand which ones we're going to treat, which ones don't necessarily need treating, right? And what are we going to treat with, right? It'll improve productivity, reduce animal disease challenge, and oh, by the way, as in the case of antibiotics, it has the potential to limit the amount of antibiotics that are utilized. I think that's probably the thing that really excites us as much as anything, is this idea of applying these concepts of precision agriculture to precision livestock production, right? We work with a group, ICASA, which is a program under the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, right? And one of the things that enticed Cargill and some of our customers and companies like Zoetis and our competitors to work with ICASA is we're truly investing in those research areas that allow us to better diagnose disease conditions, allow us to better diagnose disease conditions early so that we can make better resource decisions going forward. Justin talked a little bit about this idea of advanced animal health monitoring. We agree, right? We've invested, Cargill is partnering with companies on the dairy side where we're measuring methane emissions from dairy cattle. By measuring those methane emissions from dairy cattle, we get a better idea of controlling that carbon load into the environment, but also we get the early predictors of animal health and disease conditions that help us to understand what we can do to limit the amount of resources, and we can more precisely improve the health and welfare and productivity of these animals. You know, I was thinking about analogies, and when I run around our neighborhood on a morning after it rains, I grew up on a farm. I live in the city now, right? And so I don't run on country roads. I run around our neighborhood, not very far, very fast, but I do a little bit. And the thing that drives me crazy is that a day after a rain, people are still running their sprinklers. Now that's in the city, right? That doesn't relate to animal agriculture, but this is an analogy I thought of this morning. Is why are they running their sprinklers? It rained yesterday. Well, I'm getting my water off a well, so the water's free. And the power that I'm using to power the pump, it's just not that much, right? That's the kind of mentality that just doesn't exist within animal agriculture. Not the animal agriculture that I know of today, right? That we're not in a place of, again, run the sprinklers the day after a rain, right? And this idea of precision agriculture, precision livestock production is going to help us to make sure that we're not applying resources when it's not necessary, okay? We worked with Nestle and other nonprofits, or not, Nestle's not a nonprofit. We worked with Nestle and other companies and entities in the state of Nebraska to work on precision irrigation. And the projects are this partnership that we formed in central Nebraska about irrigation, where we're doing a better job of monitoring soil conditions. We're saving 2 billion gallons of water. So we think that's what just really excites us about this idea of using technology to control resources. We want to talk a little bit about waste, right? Again, some of the simple solutions, right? The simple solutions around doing things to control food waste. I mentioned it earlier in one of my examples, and we continue to focus on this. All the things that we can do to prevent spoilage of food and prevent premature food waste is a sustainability solution, right? At the end of the day, that animal, whether it's a pig, a steer, a chicken, a laying hen, or that fish that's swimming in an aquaculture pond, right? We've invested that resource by the fact that it swam in the ocean or swam in the pond or it walked on the earth. Our job is to make sure that we protect every ounce possible of the food that comes from that animal and that we put that to use. Basic food waste, but we're spending a lot more time on that. We're partnering with Feeding America and other nonprofits to set up and improve how excess food can get moved into areas that need it, into lower income areas that need the calories and need the protein that we produce. As a part of some of our efforts around our Beef Up sustainability effort, we're focused much more so on rotational grazing. We're focused much more so on regenerative agriculture and funding projects to do that. Regenerative agriculture is not new, right? And Joan talked a little bit about this. Some of this stuff has been around for a long time. It's basic stuff, right? But it's truly coming full circle. It's truly becoming something. When I grew up on the farm that I did in north central Kansas, we would have never thought about planting cover crops. And yet this is really an ancient practice that people used to practice. And now all of a sudden, the idea of using cover crops as an alternative to spending diesel fuel or alternative to the application of chemicals is truly a viable solution, not just to sequester carbon, but to increase basic productivity. I want to shift gears real quick. It's one of my last comments, and I want to talk a little bit about transparency, and it's been mentioned a little bit. Sometimes this transparency discussion can be a little bit uncomfortable. Joan talked about it, right? Joan mentioned, one of the best advancements from a beef sustainability standpoint is the use of the hormone implants, and yet it's one of the most sensitive topics with consumers. And I don't have an easy answer to it, but I have a story I wanted to share. We've worked with some of our customers to help them deal with an ordinance in the city of San Francisco. This ordinance in the city of San Francisco that was passed in 2018 stated that if you're a retailer of significant size in the city of San Francisco, it's your obligation to report on the antibiotic usage of the protein that you're bringing into the city of San Francisco. As a retailer, right? They didn't put it on Joan, they didn't put it on Cargill, they put it on the retailers in that market. You have to report those antibiotics. They were forcing transparency. Why were they doing it? Their concern is around antimicrobial resistance formation. They believe that there is a public health crisis. And yes, all of us are concerned about the potential for public health implications of antimicrobial resistance. In the city of San Francisco, they believed it was their obligation to the citizen. We have to control this. We're going to force transparency because we're going to force retailers in that city to report on antibiotic usage. Now, in an integrated supply chain like turkeys or broilers, it's a little easier to think about that. The consulting veterinarians work for the companies that are supplying the products. And so the decisions that are made about antibiotic usage, it's really at the control of those companies. In a company like ours, where we're buying from thousands of feed yards every year, right? We don't make the decisions about that antibiotic application. We don't have access to that data. We've tried to explain that. We, Cargill, we, our customers, we, the California grocers, have tried to explain that to the city. Hasn't been very effective. We took a different approach recently. We invited Dan Thompson from Iowa State University. Some of you know Dan. We invited Dr. Tim Kurt from ICASA, the ICASA group that I mentioned. Those gentlemen were able to have a heart-to-heart conversation with the city of San Francisco. They explained the realities. They explain the commitments that are being made to invest in alternatives, to invest in precision-based health management, right? Are we going to change that ordinance because of Dan Thompson, Dr. Dan Thompson and Dr. Tim Kurt having that conversation with the city of San Francisco? Well, probably not. But what we left with, and what we had a breakthrough moment, right, is that we had a conversation. It was an uncomfortable conversation, but we had a conversation. The city of San Francisco, we truly believe, was left with a much better understanding. On this concept of transparency, it's going to be challenging. It's not going to be, and there's going to be people that question current practices. And all I can say is we've got to be prepared to have the right voices, have the right conversations, right, in a very non-emotional way that adequately explain the choices that are made in some of these production systems and how fundamentally we're all about caring for these animals and for the planet that they walk around on. So, Christi, that's about all I got. Thank you.
That was a lot, really insightful. I loved all the examples, shows all the effort going on in the space. Joan talked about day to day, what they're doing on the farm. So collectively, this is creating a great picture. And so we're going to go to Justin for some final comments on, I mean, Scott led to a lot of the words precision and precise and transparent. And I think you tie into that with your closing remarks, Justin.
Yeah, thank you, Christi. And I guess the way we think about technology as it relates to making improvements in precision animal health, the gap we see as much as anything is the ability to communicate those technological advances. if you think about it today, a common refrain is, we are data rich, information poor. And whether we think about that on the production level or the consumer level, it's arguably not much different. I like the example of challenging our team as to taking a piece of information and making it actionable is really where technology has its opportunity. In that, if you think about the life of a beef animal, we have really 8 opportunities that animal is either in the hands of a rancher or in a chute that we can implement some sort of management practice. And that's in a progressively managed operation. And so many times I think the technology is not lacking in making improvements. It's communicating that information from the first time the animal is captured to the second or the third or the 8th. And so whether that's showcasing to the consumer some of the transparency issues that Scott addressed, or that's communicating information from the ranch and the feed yard that Joan talked about to the nutritionist and veterinarian that's helping manage that operation, I would suggest that the red lines between those dots is really one of the opportunities technology provides us. And I think, one of the best analogies I have is, many of us spend an awful lot of time with a device that's probably sitting next to you or in your pocket or maybe even in your hand as I talk right now. And I would challenge you that if that device only made phone calls, how useful would it be? And the reality of it is we all had phones a long time ago and we didn't spend that much time on them. But as they started to integrate more and more aspects of our life, whether that's making appointments for our family, integrating our work calendar with our family calendar, and ultimately keeping track of our cow records or things that we have to do around the farm and ranch, it's that integration and connectivity of data that makes that piece of technology so useful for us today. And ultimately, I think as we go forward, the ability to wrangle these sustainability solutions will be the opportunity that technology provides to gather all of the data that we have residing on paper, on our desktop computers, and in information management systems today into a method that we can communicate that to the next segment of the supply chain. And whether that's from the ranch to the backgrounding yard, or whether that's from the farrowing house to the finishing barn, or from the feed yard to the packer, the ability to connect the information that went into the production of that animal protein is ultimately what the consumer is asking about. And our ability to make use of that data is ultimately how we'll deliver it. In that, if I can't make use of the data from one segment to the other, it gets really hard to see the value proposition to the consumer. And so as we develop technology solutions with the consumer in mind, making sure that it's useful as it transfers from one segment to the next is really where we see a lot of the opportunity to address not only sustainability issues, but just ultimately efficiency of production.
Oh, thank you, Justin. Great closing comments. So we do have a few minutes to take Q&A. Again, if you would put them in the box. And while that's happening, I guess there was a question I had for you, Justin, earlier. I paused on it, but you in your first segment talked about genetic testing and said that, simplistically should be something that a consumer can't argue with. But for those not as close to it, can you elaborate a bit more in your context, what you're talking about genetic testing, which really means is finding the full potential of the animal? Just explain that a bit more.
Yeah, great question. The way I think about it, Christi, is if there was one thing that many of us would wish that we could do, it's to see into the future, right? I mean, if we get right down to it, if we knew what was going to happen tomorrow, we may make different decisions. And as I think about a technological advancement that really gives us the opportunity to do that, it is genetic testing. And whether that's the selection of replacements into the dairy or the beef herd, or ultimately, the improved genetic strains around swine and poultry, it is ultimately our best method to make population change that utilizes fewer resources. And so today I can take a calf that's born on Joan's operation. I can take a sample and ultimately predict her profitability compared to another calf on Joan's operation, looking 2 years and 7 months down the road as to the potential for her to wean a calf. And so if we think about that as a technologically advancement, I think many times genetic improvement is thought of as something, of yesteryear. But arguably, you think about whether that's the corn or soybean hybrids that are being planted today, all of those are built around how we've made genetic improvements to increase productivity. And the genetic testing enhancements that have come of late provide us that vision into the future to make informed decisions and ultimately utilize the resources more effectively, because that heifer may not be best suited to being part of the cow herd. She may be better suited to being part of the beef supply chain because of her level of productivity that we didn't know until we took the test.
I think what really struck me was Scott used the quote, "Don't embarrass me for my food choices." And at the end of the day, I'm thinking everything we heard today, why would any consumer ever feel bad about a food choice they made when we know close to it, all the effort that's going in? But I think that just is the testament to the work we've got to continue to do. I imagine most of you on the webinar today are linked to agriculture because you're on an Animal Ag Alliance webinar. And we just have work to do to continue to influence and message multiply outside of, sometimes I call it our vortex. But today we set it up to talk about how technology and innovation might support sustainability. And I thought we heard some brilliant solutions, some sophisticated. I'm going to get into precision animal health, and some pretty simplistic. When Joan talked about putting shade on the animals and what that does for productivity, and each of them, whether simple or sophisticated, still need a communication element with it. And I think that's a hat all of us have to put on, whether we started in our career thinking we'd be communicators. I don't think we can avoid it today, no matter where you're at in the food supply chain. And so I will close with that again, I hope you learned some new things going on day to day at farm, through the whole food chain. But also, we've got to continue to be mindful of how we share and how we talk, and be proud of all the good stuff going on, and being mindful of continuously trying to improve.